I'm very happy to introduce Tony as our speaker this evening, although of course he doesn't need much of an introduction because he is a member and most people do know him as that, and they also know him as maybe the curator at the National Waterways Museum in Gloucester for 15 years. And his knowledge of canals is absolutely superb. He's published a book called Canals in Britain, which is still available. And he's conducted many, many tours of Gloucester docks. He's taken groups around Olney Island and presented his talks at lots of meetings, which have been held in the Gala Club for many years. And of course, those were always organised by John Lovell. Now, this particular presentation that you're about to see is one that Tony did as part of the History Festival in the Edshed in September. But unfortunately, it was in front of a very small audience. Only about 15 people were able to take part. And I received so many emails from members who couldn't get a ticket. So I'm really, really pleased that Tony has agreed to give his talk again here for this evening. And I'd like to say over to you now, Tony. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Right, technical bits first. Try and find some pictures. Be there in a second, hopefully. Right, hopefully everybody's got the picture of Edward Colston, which is really where this talk began, in that at about the time that Bristol went a bit crazy and threw Edward Colston into the docks, several of us were asked by the local radio station whether we could talk about Gloucester and the slave trade. And I said, no, I couldn't possibly talk about Gloucester and the slave trade because I knew absolutely nothing about it. And then I thought back to the education process I went through, and I realized that I'd been taught that there was a triangular trade, some of which worked out of Bristol, and that slaves were involved, and that William Wilberforce had waved a magic wand and sorted it all out. So I thought, well, let's try and find out a bit more. And I've looked specifically at Gloucester, a little bit at Gloucestershire, and our effects both on slaving, the trade, and on the people who are against slavery, trying to resolve what the country should do. Back in 1833, Parliament finally stopped slavery in the English colonies. And to do that, they took a massive fund. 40% of Treasury income for the year was set aside to compensate the slave owners. Not compensate the slaves, there's never been compensation for them or the countries they were involved with. But to get out of it, they basically had to buy off a lot of the Parliament, the church, and others who were heavily, heavily involved in it. It was one of those moments where the country had to really think about what it was doing. If you look at slavery in Gloucestershire, you have to start in Bristol. Bristol, for a long time, was the premier port for boats sailing out to Africa with goods. And slavery really comes in 4 bits. You get the first bit, which is the privateers, the people who are pioneering the trade, which had already been started by Portuguese and the Spanish. And then you get the nationalization, and then you get the privatization, and then you get the bit after slavery is banned, and we'll get to that later on. So early slave trade, people sailing from Bristol, like Captain Thomas Wyndham, and they gave the local industries quite a boost to start with, because they would sail with cloth from the Stroudwater valleys, they'd sail with copper from the Bristol Copper Works, and that in the long run involves Swansea as well, because these were the sort of goods that they took out to swap with the Moors, the Arabs, and the Africans, because there were lots of people involved in the buying and selling of slaves. When you get on in time, those early journeys have started a business, and Judge Jeffreys, visiting Bristol in 1685, he's on the court circuit, but he's also looking after the interests of James II, and James is his boss, really. And he comes to Bristol and he says, "My goodness me, this is terrible." But he's not actually complaining about the slave trade. What he's complaining about is the fact that people from Bristol are still involved in it, because basically slavery has been nationalized under the Crown. The Royal Africa Company, set up in 1660 to help the king get his finances back in order after the Civil War and the Restoration, is there to take gold out of Africa, therefore guineas, gold from Guinea for guineas, and it's in charge of the slave trade. And people from Bristol essentially are not meant to be involved unless they're doing it under the aegis of the Crown. And that upset people, because they basically said, this is the best trade the country has got. How can it all go to the king? What do we fight a civil war for? We want part of the action. And they worked very hard at getting it privatized. And by the 1690s, the arguments raged that people from Bristol should be part of this trade. And the Crown stood back, and trade commenced as a legal business. And it took about 80 years until the trade was 80% of Britain's overseas earnings and investments, a massive amount of money on this triangular trade, and involved with moving slaves to the West Indies and moving the products of slavery back to this country from the West Indies. The people who were doing the trade looked to rationalize and excuse what they were doing. I think a lot of people probably realized that there were human beings involved in this. Africa was not it was not a disorganized country. It was there were some very large cities. There was a lot of organization, and there were countries there working perfectly well. But from the outside, people said, well, it's a culture, it's not like us. They don't have one god, they have lots of gods. We can do what we like with them. Those who looked at the slave trade, went out there with the boats and wrote about it afterwards, said it's horrendous, really. The Africans were quite capable of actually killing themselves before they got on the boats. And again, you get the argument, slavery takes on the burden of caring for inferior beings. So you justify the trade in shipping people across the Atlantic in terrible conditions, losing a lot of the cargo on the journey. You're actually improving people. You're giving them the chance to go for the right religion. You give them the chance to get educated whilst working for you. When it came to later days and justifying slavery in front of parliamentary committees, Mr. Norris standing up on behalf of the Liverpool slave trade, and Liverpool would become the premier port by the late after 1750. And Norris says the men play and sing, the women get fanciful beads, and they can sit and they can play on the boat, and it's all fine. The other view, people like Alexander Falconbridge, essentially they had to get the slaves up on deck every day and get them to move. So they made them dance. They played the music, they made them dance. And if they didn't dance, they were whipped until they did, because it was the only way of actually getting people across the Atlantic and in a fit position to be sold when they got to the other side. And the other side for a lot of slaves was the West Indies. William Berryman was an artist paid to go out by a estate owner, and he went out to Jamaica and he takes the tranquil island. And in the middle of his picture there on the left are slaves cutting sugarcane. And it was, of course, the sugarcane, it was the sugar industry that was the driving force for the West Indies and why slaves were required to go out there. And people from Bristol, from Gloucestershire went out there. And again, you get the justification. Slavery must be fine. God has provided these Africans to work for us. Otherwise, we'd have known that it was wrong to use them. And you get the view of the slaves themselves. The slaves, there were educated slaves, and there were slaves who became educated in slavery. And the work that they did and the jobs that they had to do were long hours, painful jobs, and difficult jobs. So cutting sugarcane, making salt. And amongst their overseers, there were two things. One was to impose your power over the slave, and the other was the fear of slave rebellion. Thomas Thistlewood seems to have been a fairly ordinary guy. He wrote a diary, and in it you can see just how some of these people controlled the slaves under them. Basically, punishments, cuts with lemon juice applied, leaving people out in the full sun with no water all day, all sorts of different punishments, and especially amongst the men, the ability to take slave women as mistresses, lovers, or casual flings. And that seems to have been fairly widespread. It was a matter of control. There were very few white people and lots of slaves. The slaves themselves lived in villages. On the right, you've got one of the American slave institutions that's been preserved. On the left, you've got a Berryman picture. And yes, they farmed for themselves. They had little allotments, which they had a bit of time at weekends, and they could feed themselves and add to their lives. But essentially, they were there and they were in captivity to work. All that funded money coming back to this country. And for example, Prinnage had two slave-owning families. A man called Munby Goulburn was there for a while, a young man, very profligate, and Prinnage was his country house. He lived in London. He went bankrupt, sold the house on to the Howell family. The Howell family were there, and both the Goulburns and the Howells were making money out of estates in the West Indies. Somewhere that people will know quite well, Bowden Hall. Retired civil servant, not a Gloucestershire man, but coming back to live in Gloucestershire and becoming Lord Lieutenant of the council of the county, and owning slaves. And the figures here, it's always difficult to get figures proper. They're coming from the UCL website, University College of London, who've done a lot of work on the back end of the slave trade, looking at the compensation payments and looking at the people who received the compensation payments and the estates that they were getting the money from. So they're looking at the links back to the West Indies. But when slavery finished, a lot of money came flooding back into this country, not into the countries that the slaves lived in. Tiverton Court had a family there, and again, the eldest son was sent out by his parents to look at the way the estates were working, and unfortunately died of yellow fever. And that was one of the curses of the white people, was that it wasn't necessarily healthy to be around the slave areas. But again, Tiverton Court would have had money coming into it, not built by slave money, but slaves are a part of its history. And you can look over the county, and we'll go to a couple of others in a minute or two. But there were also, at the time of compensation in the 1830s, much smaller demands. So Newark Park, someone in Stroud, and at the bottom there, Charlotte Pinnock, living in 7 Wellington Parade, Gloucester. She got some money. There was a lot of arguing at the time of compensation, because some people had money lent to them, and the money would go to the mortgage people first, and then to the people who actually owned the slaves. So there was a lot of legal work done at the time. But money went in all sorts of directions. In Gloucestershire, a lot of money went into Cheltenham, because people from Bristol had retired to Cheltenham, and people in Cheltenham had money invested in the West Indies as well. You look at the really big estates, and you look at the Codrington family, MP for Tewkesbury and MCC member, not that that means anything. But he had slaves spread across the Caribbean. The Codrington family had been in the Caribbean for an awful long time. And the amount of money that he got from that was absolutely huge. And one of the reasons why in 1807, when the transport of slaves to the West Indies was stopped, that slavery could continue, was the fact that they'd built up such a population of slaves that some places could provide new slaves from the families who were actually breeding in slavery. And the Codringtons were accused of keeping Barbuda as a nursery and basically a baby farm to carry on supplying slavery. And the Codringtons had had land spread across the West Indies. At one point, the will of Christopher Codrington sent money to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, as it would become. And he provided them with a slave estate to provide them with money. And it was also going to be the Codrington College, which was going to teach people religion that they could then spread to the slaves themselves. And on those estates, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel branded their slaves with the word society. Codrington College is still going today. It's an American foundation these days, and they say they wrestle with their history and where it started from. Still a religious college. The Codringtons have left money elsewhere, so All Souls in Oxford has the Codrington Library, and the statue there of Mr. Codrington, and that's one of these legacies. The legacies of slavery pop up all over the place. When you get to the compensation stage, there are lots and lots of arguments about where the money goes because of investments. Looking back to who was owed money from where is quite difficult. And the Codringtons had a battle with a family called the Johnstons. Johnstons were the very rich people. And one of the Johnstons had actually become Sir William Pulteney, taking his wife's name at marriage because she also had money. Sir William Pulteney building Pulteney Bridge in Bath to connect his estate into Bath, building quite a lot of bits of Bath, building quite a lot of the best bits of Weymouth, incredibly wealthy man. And Sir William Pulteney, or Johnston as he had been, was the MP for Shrewsbury. And in London, he'd also worked with a young man from the same area of Scotland as he'd started from. And he liked to do that with people. And Thomas Telford, who came to Gloucester to finish off the Gloucester and Berkeley Canal, was a protege of Sir William Pulteney. In Shropshire, he got a job directly because of Pulteney, and his work as an engineer was backed by slave money, though Telford never earned it himself. Well, there's Telford standing in front of the length of canal that we'd now call Baker's Quay on the waterway. Baker's Quay, developed by Samuel Baker and Thomas Philpotts, who were West Indies estate owners and getting a considerable amount of compensation, probably somewhere around £5 million in today's money, and investing it back into Gloucester. Gloucester does not become a slave port in the same way as Bristol did, because Gloucester is coming late to the game. If the canal had been sort of built in between 1793 and 1796 and opened, I'm sure a lot more slave money would have come into it, but it didn't, because it didn't open until 1827. But Baker and Philpotts certainly saw that they could try to compete with London, bringing in products from the West Indies and supplying the West Midlands. And they are probably the key link at that point in the story. And Samuel Baker was a very rich man, investing in the waterway. While he was there, he lived at Hynham Court, and then he went on to Lypiat Park. And he was at Lypiat Park when he was very much part of the development of the local railway network throughout the 1840s, and he then went on to Worcester in the long run. Philpotts was a Gloucester man, working out of London quite a lot of the time, and Philpotts' warehouse in the dock was built by Abraham Philpotts, his son, but again based on the West Indies trade and the estates that they had and the slaves that they'd sold off. So a lot of connection with the West Indies. There were slaves in America, and that was a developing side of things. The West Indies had more slaves than America in terms of British connections. But for America, you look to George Whitefield. George Whitefield, born in the Bell Inn in Gloucester in Southgate Street, and a most amazing evangelical preacher, a man who helped bring about what they call the American Awakening, the First Awakening, bringing religion, nonconformist religion to America, starting off Methodism with the Wesleys, but actually falling out with them in the long run. And one of several preachers who helped bring America together as a set of states that would then start to look for independence. And his statue has stood at the University in Philadelphia for a long time. But now there are plans for a slightly more structured withdrawal of his statue than Bristol managed. And for why? Well, Whitefield is one of the most conflicted men to do with slaves and slavery you could meet. A man who could bring joy to people's hearts with religion, and a man who realized that slaves were not well looked after, that people should do better. But in the same speech, he worries that slaves should get the upper hand. He has that worry of the slave owner of revolt and revolution amongst the slaves that will wipe out bits of the white population. Indeed, in the long run, he was funding an orphanage in Georgia through the output of estates worked by slaves. And he becomes so involved with slavery that he actually helps Georgia, which had been set up as a non-slave state. It had been set up as a state to be run by, well, almost on green lines, by weavers and small businessmen, not a large exploitative state. But people saw that they could grow sugarcane. They saw that they could grow tobacco, cotton, and rice, amongst other things. And he argues that you can't do these things without Negroes. You can't do these things without slaves. And he and his words helped turn Georgia from being a non-slave state into a slave state. And when you look at George Whitefield and you read information on the web, his link into the slave trade is scarcely ever recognized. In Gloucester, we have Button Gwinnett, our local man from down Hatherley, who signs the Declaration of Independence. It has to be said that Button Gwinnett is not the world's most successful anything. He left this country having had businesses. He moved to Georgia, filling in on the footsteps of Whitefield, and he took on an estate and owned slaves on the Georgia coast. He went into politics. He wasn't very successful at politics, but that's where he gets to sign the Declaration of Independence. And then he dies in a duel with another politician fairly shortly afterwards. In this country is difficult because it doesn't recognize slaves. Those slaves are definitely part of it. If you go to Newent and you walk around the churchyard, on the back of the church, the park side, you'll find the gravestone of Thomas Bloomsbury, 55 years a faithful servant to the late Samuel Richardson, a man of color who'd come to this country as a slave. And there are lists on websites, Radical Stroud, for instance, and lists in the archives of the slaves who'd come to this country, some runners, some as so-called servants, often slaves. And you find them in the newspapers, especially like the bottom entry here, where they've run away from their owners. All sorts of people come back to this country. So just outside the county at St. Arvan's, Nathaniel Wells, landowner, very much part of the county set, but so much a man of color as to be little removed from a Negro, said Joseph Farrington. He was the son of a domestic slave and a white father, but he owned slaves himself and was compensated for them. In Gloucester, you get Richard Raikes trying to get a job for a man called John Hart. And if he wasn't so black, surely he'd get a job. They tried to get him a job at the Bisley Bluecoat School. In the long run, you find John Hart working in the census of 1841 in Gloucester, in Southgate Street, at Decrypt as a schoolmaster, and he dies in 1842 and is buried at Turley. So eventually somebody did give him a job. Having slaves, runners and slaves in this country really began to get people looking at just what sort of trade this was. And amongst the Quakers, people like Granville Sharp, they recognized the problems and began to think that the slave trade ought to be stopped. Granville Sharp and his brother was a doctor treating a runaway slave who'd been beaten up. And Sharp, as a lawyer, had 3 or 4 different cases of slaves who'd run, got to this country, people like James Somerset. And in the case of Somerset, the owners, who thought they were the legal owners, had Somerset put in a hulk and waiting to be taken back to the West Indies. And Sharp managed to get the argument taken up by the Lord Chief Justice. And try as Lord Mansfield might to find a reason why James Somerset should be sent back, he couldn't. And therefore he had to say, because we don't recognize slavery in this country, the black must be discharged. He is allowed to stay. And Granville Sharp, looking at these actions, became one of the people pushing and pushing to get slavery stopped in one way or another. Lots of other people began to join in, especially amongst the non-conformist community. Thomas Clarkson, another great name here, a Quaker from Wisbech over in Cambridgeshire. And he came around the country speaking at all sorts of places and taking head on the slave trade in Bristol, for instance. And he would carry with him Clarkson's box with the famous diagram of the slave ship with the slaves all laid out to show how they were carried, and the items that went from this country to help fuel the slave trade, and the items that came back. And people began to start things like the sugar boycott. Don't take sugar from the West Indies, it comes from slaves. Take it from elsewhere in the British Empire. Because a lot of that early opposition was non-conformist, it couldn't find its way into Parliament. The Quakers, for instance, would not swear on the Bible, and the testing was yet to be worked out. So they needed to find somebody who could stand up for them in Parliament, and they found William Wilberforce from the church, and he was the man that would push at the parliamentary end of things for this body of Quakers and nonconformists elsewhere. And eventually he is the man who gets his name put onto the end of the slave trade. It always interests me that there's William Wilberforce fighting against the slave trade. At the same time, he hates the fact that the Quaker women are all involved in the matter, and really ladies should be not seen and not heard in this thing. It's for men to sort out. So Parliament from the 1790s, Wilberforce introduced a bill to outlaw slavery in every session of every parliament, but it was seen as really unpatriotic. We were fighting a continuous set of wars with the French, and if you mentioned slavery, by and large, it was the fact that Britain will not be slaves. It will not be slaves to the French. We must carry on fighting. Slavery and patriotism got entirely mixed up together, but people would not end the slave trade at that time. And it wasn't until Trafalgar and feeling safe from the French that the trade was finally abolished. Slavery wasn't abolished, purely the sending of slaves from Africa to the West Indies by the British. There were still slaves moving by the Portuguese and the Spanish, Mexicans, and others. There was quite a lot of opposition, not at least from people like King Bonny of Nigeria, who really thought that they should be allowed to sell their own countrymen and continue to sell their own countrymen. They couldn't see why the British were getting so upset about it. The Royal Navy, that had been supporting the slave trade by protecting vessels, now formed a squadron to stop slavery. And you get examples of that with Captain Broughton, who would eventually move to Cheltenham when he retired. And he would do that on the back of money that he got from stopping slavery. The estates continued, but they promised reform. And from Parliament, people sent out pleas and questions as to what was happening. The gradual mitigation and the mitigation and the gradual abolition of slavery was the name of the committee, which really shows the way that we approached the end of the slave trade very, very, very slowly. The slave islands themselves just thought that slavery should continue. But increasingly through the 1820s, 1830s, sugar itself came under pressure. There were lots of other places providing sugar at cheaper prices. And the whole economy of the West Indies began to get very, very difficult. The man overseeing this was the Earl of Bathurst. He was the minister for the colonies, working through this process of abolition and gradual mitigation. The Bathurst estates, he was the third Earl. It was the first Earl who'd bought the estates. And again, that was with the proceeds of owning estates in the West Indies and owning slaves. Typical of the period is this, a man who became briefly rector of Maysmore in 1842. And he he'd been a vicar in Jamaica. He found he could make a lot of money in Jamaica, wedding slaves and others. And he was part of trying to bring the organized religion to slaves. But he found that it was really very difficult, because actually the nonconformists, especially the Baptists, had got such a hold with the slaves that they wouldn't look at the Church of England. And you get a whole series of battles between different religions affecting the slaves themselves. This is a man who is absolutely fascinating. He becomes the secretary to Bishop Monk and dies eventually at Beachley. He's worth a talk in his own right. He's also an early follower of photography and archaeology. But the point, I think, is that he is part of this train of people on the slave islands, desperately worried about the fact that the slaves might rise up and kill the white population, and never really linking that with the fact that maybe slavery wasn't correct in the first place. So with a committee that was mitigating and moving slowly, it suddenly got a boost from something called the Agency Committee. And at the heart of that were two Gloucestershire men, Joseph Sturge from Ulverston near Bristol, the Sturge family, and Samuel Bowley, who moved to Gloucester. And the two of them really pushed hard to get slavery outlawed and finished in the 1830s, meeting after meeting, and with incredible organized opposition from the pro-slavery lobby. But they pushed very hard. Sturge was a businessman in the docks, owning warehouses and importing grain, and with estates on the West Indies, but not slave estates. Bowley was a cheese factor. He imported food, huge links to the Irish trade, born at Arlington Mill, Bybury, and then moving into Gloucester itself. And those two are central to the end of the slave trade. In Jamaica, at the heart of the slave trade. News that people were moving ahead with the end of slavery was discussed, and people like Thomas Burchell from Gloucestershire, from Tetbury, Baptist minister, were pushing hard with the education of the slaves and really trying to get them ready for emancipation. Burchell had to come back to this country in 1830 because he was ill, and it was really expected by people like Sam Sharp, one of Burchell's slave ministers, that when Burchell came back, he would bring with him news of the end of the slave trade. And when it was clear that that wasn't happening, Sam Sharp started a strike, and that strike turned into a war. And it's fairly clear that the Baptist-led slaves were heavily opposed by the English church, the established church. And it's almost a religious war with slavery as part of it. And that was one of the last big insurrections put down with savagery. Sam Sharp was hanged, and many slaves died as a result of it. The revolution, as it were, died out. And finally, in 1833, the committee got its way through Parliament, and the country decided that slavery would end, with that huge compensation scheme, and with the fact that slaves would have to work their way towards freedom in an apprentice scheme. And the apprentice scheme, as it turned out, was almost worse than slavery itself. The event was celebrated, and celebrated in style by Henry Wyatt, who was part of the Stroud anti-slavery committee, with the arch that is now the entrance to Archway School. And that is about the only monument put up at the time to the end of the slave trade. The compensation was paid out in small amounts and in huge amounts. So Sir John Gladstone, who'd lived in Gloucester in the 1820s, father of William Gladstone, later to be Prime Minister, a major slave owner, he was getting compensation. He came to Gloucester, bring his wife to the spa. Something like £75 million compensation for his slaves. He was involved in Gloucester banking, but he was really a national politician, and his son, with that money behind it, would become a Liberal politician. Sturge and Bowley were unhappy with the apprentice system. Even though slavery had finished, they said, actually, nothing has changed. You've paid out this compensation to the owners, but the slaves themselves are still in much the same position. You don't call it slavery anymore, you call it apprenticeship. And they would work very hard with meetings all over the place to push for the end of the apprenticeship system and the proper and true emancipation of slaves. In Jamaica and other places where slavery had finished, in many cases, the trade had also finished, and the economies of the islands absolutely fell away. New free villages would be started up. So Sturge Town still exists in Jamaica. The Sturges would have lime plantations and others where they employed ex-slaves, and that is something that went on in the Sturge family right through the 1950s when they were bought out. Even Thomas Burchell from Tetbury is still remembered over in Jamaica with Youth Development Foundation. So those anti-slave people are definitely remembered. It's an interesting fact that Sturge and Bowley, big men in the area, Sturge as a businessman, Bowley as a businessman, would work on the railway committees, developing the new railways, sitting on the same committee as Samuel Baker, the great slaver, those two, the great anti-slavers. There was a pragmatism to the whole business, which meant that these people would work together. And when Baker built warehouses in the docks, by the Lock Warehouse and the Pillar and Lucy warehouse, amongst the first people to take leases on those warehouses was Sturge. So the anti-slaver was quite happy to work with the slaver. After 1838, when slavery had finally finished and the apprentice scheme had finished, Clarkson and others, Joseph Sturge being the secretary and the leader of the meeting, brought together a huge meeting in London in 1840, bringing people from all over the world. You can imagine what it was like traveling from America and other parts of the world to a meeting in London. 3-day meeting, of which they managed to spend a 6th arguing not about slavery, but about whether women should be allowed to speak in the body of the meeting. Very quickly after the end of the slave trade, people began to question whether they'd done the right thing. And in this country, there was a lot of pro-slavery talk. And in fact, pro-slavers felt that they might even restart the slave trade at any time. When it got to the American Civil War, there was a lot of support for the South, even though that was in support of slaves. And so in the South were the slavers, and people in this country supporting the South were supporting slavery. And people had to come over to this country. So free slaves, Cella Martin, coming to preach in Gloucester. You can imagine what he said, the gallantry of the South, but please remember the cause for which we're fighting from the North. It is to free slaves, amongst other things. Admiral Christian, or Captain Christian as he was, Gloucester's second police chief, as a naval captain, was actually involved with running goods out of the south of America during the Civil War against the policy of the country. As a naval officer, he was captured by the Americans and sent back. He didn't receive a punishment. As a captain, he came to run the police force in Gloucestershire, and during that time, running the police force, he was actually sent up to being an admiral. So supporting the slave-owning South didn't do him any harm. Samuel White Baker is remembered as an explorer and sometimes is put down as a great anti-slaver. He is the son of the baker of Baker's Quay. And he married Florence Baker, a woman that he'd rescued from a slave market in the east of Europe, and a great romantic tale, and employed by the British government in the Upper Nile Valley to end slavery. But his attitude shows the way that anti-slavery had led on into out and out racism. Slavery was about business, but the legacy of slavery would be racism. We started with statues and we'll end with statues. In 1859, Joseph Sturge died, and he was remembered in Birmingham. And the greater the good of the liberal part of the country came together to the unveiling of his statue. Lots was said about his fight against drink, about his support of the poor, and a little was said about his great long fight against slavery. That statue is still there, and it's there in 5 ways in Birmingham. Bowley lived on a bit longer, and he was able to say it's what we do as English people. We really ought to think about the underdog and protect the underdog. Wonderful words that he used. It wasn't until 1895 that Bristol decided that they should put up a statue to a leading citizen, Mr. Colston. Colston had died back in 1721. And the speeches that went with putting up his statue were all about how gallant little Bristol had helped rule the world of merchants, sent out its little ships around the world to do its good, and how that example should be followed by Bristol of the 1890s, the civic pride of the great city. There was no mention of the slave trade whatsoever when Colston's statue was unveiled. So Gloucester is involved with the slave trade. The country is involved with the slave trade. When you've got a trade that is 80% of export earnings back in the 1780s, there is nothing that does not have slave money in it. I think it's interesting that you know your history, and until you actually know your history of your involvement, it's very difficult to see where things like Colston going into the dock stand generally. I shall finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. I think I've been unmuted again now, yes. We'd like to ask people if they've got questions. There is a chat button at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, you can post your question there for Tony to answer. But I have to say how absolutely fascinating that was, and quite shocking to hear exactly how people were involved, and the religious people going out and spreading the word, but still owning lots of slaves. It seems incomprehensible these days. But as people, as you've said, there were lots of people who just thought it was absolutely fine at that time. Do we have anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question? It's difficult because we can't see you all, but if you do want to ask a question of Tony, please can you just flag it up on the chat? It would be helpful.
Or put your hand up and I'll see if I can spot you and unmute you if you wanted to ask. We've got one there from Juliet Bailey. Who worked Bowley's estate if not enslaved Africans?
I think that's probably Sturge's estate rather than Bowley. Bowley was not involved with the West Indies. He was involved with the end of the slave trade. Sturge had estates out there, and there were people with estates in the West Indies who paid the population, and that population, some of that would have been ex-slaves. There were slaves who bought their way out of slavery. There were people as a result of rebellions who'd mixed with what was the end of the native population of the West Indies. So there was a workforce that could be employed out there as well. And of course, you could take a slave and make them free and pay them.
I think the next question is from Alec Hamilton. And he says, what connection did Granville Sharp have with Gloucester?
Right, I've forgotten the direct which one it was. I think it was a sister or a niece who was married into the Lloyd Baker family of Hardwick Court. So the Granville Sharp's family were connected with the Lloyd Bakers, and Sharp's papers came down into the Lloyd Baker family and were then passed on to the archive at Gloucester.
I don't know if you can see if anybody else is putting a hand up, Gareth. I can't. I can only see about 6 people, so I've got no idea. And there's no other questions put up at the moment.
We've got Julie Harper, Sue. So
Okay.
if I just ask you to unmute, Julie, you can ask the question. There you go.
I've been watching David Olusoga's programs on BBC just after the Bite Size programs. And one of the people he mentions and says is a person whose contribution has in many ways been overlooked is in fact Granville Sharp. And he gives a lot of detail about how he became involved in concerns about slavery in Britain and in the colonies. And if anybody hasn't seen the programme, it's really worth watching them. They contain a lot of very interesting information. And Tony also has provided a lot more information, and it just sort of emphasises how much we do not know about our history today of involvement in slavery and subsequently in racism. And I would like to thank Tony because his talk contains information that was not in David Olusoga's talk, but very much complements it. Yeah.
I think David's work is fantastic. His book on Black British history is well worth a read. It is fascinating. It's scary what we do not know. And I mean, slavery is only one topic out of many that we don't know, but it is such a fundamental building block at a time when the nation needed a lot of money pumped into it. It got a lot of money pumped into it from a trade that was basically trading other people across the Atlantic. And if you can't change slavery, it happened. What we have to do is to understand it in the modern context.
Yes.
And unless you know the history, it is very difficult to see why things like Edward Colston's statue going into the dock in Bristol happen. Whether you agree with that or you don't agree with it, you can begin to understand why such things can happen.
I would agree.
We have another part of another question that follows on from Alec Hamilton, and he says, please can you tell us more about Mumby Goulburn of Prynich? His name alone is worth gold. Yes,
his name is fantastic. You'll understand that I haven't looked at every one of these people. Mumby Goulburn, if you want to find a little bit more about him, and there isn't very much, on the University College of London website, look for UCL slavery compensation on the Google. You will find all sorts of people who were legacies of slavery, and Mumby Goulburn is one of those. A rich young man who lived beyond his means and had to sell up his Gintry house. And that's basically all I know about him. I'm terribly sorry, but he has got a lovely name.
Yeah. Very, very unusual, isn't it? That first part of it, Mumby. I wonder where that came from. That's quite amazing. I think it's so important to show our appreciation to Tony for that wonderful talk. And it's the only way really that we can do it. So everybody likes to clap in the normal way and say thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tony. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
To everybody. Now, I also just want to say before we go, again, thank you very much to Gareth, who hosts all these meetings every time, and without his technical expertise. Thank you again, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hey.
Tony.
Good night.